Hello and welcome. I'm Sima Katauka and you are watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories. Iran's Revolutionary Guards claim their hypersonic missiles penetrated Israeli defenses as Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei vows no mercy. Israel strikes Tehran's missile site. Meanwhile, Donald Trump demands Iran's unconditional surrender and deploys additional U.S. fighter jets to the region. As G7 leaders, excluding Donald Trump, united in support of the Ukraine, the U.S. blocked a strong joint statement on Russia. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney announced new sanctions against Moscow, and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi held crucial bilateral meetings with the presidents of South Africa, Mexico, and the Prime Minister of Australia. Russia killed at least 18 people, including an American, in its deadliest airstrike on Kyiv this year, according to reports, while the US condemned it and French President Emmanuel Macron slammed Putin's complete cynicism. Israeli tank fire killed at least 59 Palestinians and wounded 221 in Khan Yunis after firing on a crowd gathered for food aid. According to medics, the Israeli military acknowledged firing in the area and said it is investigating this incident. The U.S. Judge Julia Kobik has blocked President Donald Trump's passport policy nationwide, ruling it likely unconstitutional for denying transgender, non-binary, and intersex people passports that reflect their gender identities, according to reports. South Korean President Lee Jae-myung and Japan's Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba pledged to deepen inseparable ties and boost U.S. Japan-Korea cooperation in their first G7 sideline summit, amid North Korea and China threats. Meanwhile, Japan's export dropped 1.7% last month, according to media reports. Indonesia's Mount Lewotobi laki-laki erupts, spewing a massive 11-kilometer high ash cloud, according to reports, prompting the volcanology agency to raise the alert to its highest level. Residents within 66-kilometer radius are urged to evacuate immediately. OpenAI CEO Sam Altman says Meta offered $100 million bonuses to lure his employees. According to reports, speaking on the Uncapped podcast, the OpenAI CEO claimed Meta is targeting top engineers to boost its super intelligence team, but none of our best people have taken them up on that, he said. Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei said that Iran will show Israel no mercy as the air war between the two enters its sixth day, despite a call from U.S. President Donald Trump for Iran's unconditional surrender. Khamenei made the comment on a post on social media platform X, saying that Iran must give a strong response to the Israeli regime. This comes after Trump warned on social media that U.S. patience was wearing thin. While he said there was no intention to kill Iran's leader for now, his comments suggested a more aggressive stance towards Iran as he weighs whether to deepen U.S. involvement. According to reports, an Israeli official has also confirmed that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been in frequent contact with President Donald Trump, speaking with him almost daily since the conflict erupted last week. Their most recent phone call took place shortly before Trump convened a National Security Council meeting at the White House. Moreover, reports suggest that Trump's emergency meeting in the Situation Room of the White House, which lasted an hour and 20 minutes, was held to discuss whether the U.S. should join Israel to strike Iranian nuclear sites. Meanwhile, Iran and Israel launched new missile strikes at each other. The Israeli military said that 2 barrages of Iranian missiles were launched towards Israel in the first 2 hours of Wednesday morning as explosions were heard over Tel Aviv. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps have stated that hypersonic missiles were used during the latest attack on Israel. Israel told residents in a southwestern area of Tehran to evacuate so its air force could strike Iranian military installations. Meanwhile, explosions were heard in eastern Tehran, according to reports. Local Iranian media said Israel was attacking a university linked to Iran's Revolutionary Guards in the east of the capital. Reports also indicated that Israel was also attacking the Hojir ballistic missile facility near Tehran, which was also targeted by Israeli airstrikes last October. Meanwhile, world elections have been pouring in amid escalating hostilities between Israel and Iran. In South America, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro condemned Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's military actions and urged the American public to reject U.S. involvement. In the Israel-Iran war, Maduro called for peace, saying one voice rises, no to war. Here's what the Venezuelan president has said.
Basta de la locura de Netanyahu contra los pueblos musulmanes, los pueblos árabes y los pueblos del mundo. Le hago un llamado al pueblo de Estados Unidos, al pueblo noble que se ha visto en las calles recientemente. Solo el pueblo de Estados Unidos puede derrotar la locura de que Estados Unidos se involucre en la guerra. Es un llamado que hacemos desde la Venezuela pacifista, desde la Venezuela bolivariana, que desde las calles, de todos los rincones, de norte a sur, de este a oeste, en los Estados Unidos de Norteamérica, se levante una sola voz. No a la guerra, no a la guerra, no war, no war, no war. Al gobierno de la República Popular China, al gobierno de Rusia, al gobierno de Turquía, al gobierno de los países del Consejo del Golfo, Qatar, Emiratos Árabes, Arabia Saudita, Kuwait, y a todos los países del sur global, pero en especial a los países musulmanes, que acompañemos a la República Islámica de Irán en su deseo de paz, en su derecho de paz, en el derecho del pueblo de Irán, y paremos y se pare esta locura.
French President Emmanuel Macron, while speaking at the G7 summit in Canada, warned that any attempt to change Iran's regime would lead to chaos in the Middle East. Macron emphasized the need for diplomacy and urged the United States to play a central role in restarting talks with Tehran. He said he believes President Donald Trump prefers a ceasefire between the warring sides. Let's listen in to what he has said.
De manière constante, le président Trump, avec qui j'ai les meilleures relations du monde, est dans sa première mandat, et aujourd'hui, il a fait une chose, c'est qu'il essaie d'obtenir la paix. À chaque fois ce qu'il dit. Et je ne l'ai jamais vu se joindre à des opérations militaires. Donc je pense en effet qu'il essaie de mettre la pression dans cette situation. C'est sans doute ça. Mais enfin, mon rôle n'est pas de faire des spéculations, de les commenter. C'est au président, à son administration, d'expliciter leur position, pas à moi de le faire. On a besoin des États-Unis d'Amérique pour faire revenir tout le monde autour de la table.
On the other hand, in Turkey, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has accused Netanyahu of being the biggest threat to regional peace. In a phone call with Qatar's Emir, Erdogan said he would continue working to end the violence and denounced Netanyahu's actions as destabilizing the entire Middle East. Now we have guests joining us for this discussion. Jim Rice, he's a professor of international law, joining us live from Philippines. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to NewsX World. Could this sixth day of conflict tip over into direct confrontation between U.S. and Iranian forces, especially in proxy regions like Iraq or Syria?
Thanks for having me on. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit of feedback here. I certainly hope not. I hope that this situation de-escalates and calms down. However, this inflammatory and dangerous rhetoric from Trump is certainly not helping anything. In fact, it's creating chaos rather than trying to stabilize the situation. In terms of your question more precisely, in terms of other regions such as Iraq and Syria, that is hard to speculate on, as Syria seems to, the regime has been overthrown, and Syria is obviously now in a rebuilding process. In terms of Iraq, it's very hard to tell whether the conflict will spread, but the problem is that what Trump is doing is destabilizing the situation. And were the United States to get involved, such as using bunker buster bombs to try and bomb the nuclear sites, this would undoubtedly deepen and spread the conflict.
And does Israel's call for civilian evacuations in Tehran meet international humanitarian law standards?
No, because the use of force is prohibited under the United Nations Charter. Also, I think that the demand that Trump made by tweet for unconditional surrender, it constitutes a threat of force. So in my view, under international law, that is a threat of force which is prohibited under international law.
And according to you, how unified is Israeli public opinion behind Prime Minister Netanyahu's military campaign, especially after high-profile strikes like the one on Iran's nuclear sites and killing of General Shadmani? Is there visible dissent within Israel?
I can't speak for the popular opinion in Israel in terms of their views regarding Netanyahu in this present conflict. But I will say that there is a very, very powerful opposition movement arising out of Netanyahu's failure to end the Gaza war. And if I can just pivot slightly, I just need to speak out in terms of international law that the use of force and firing artillery or tanks on civilians queuing for aid in Gaza feeding places is unacceptable and completely illegal under international law. I'm sorry if I digress from your original question.
Don't worry about it. And now we move on to the bigger picture. Could this conflict shift alliances in the Middle East, for example, pushing Iran closer to China or Russia?
Well, I mean, they already are. I don't really see the danger of that. Iran has been closely aligned with Putin in Russia for some time, as well as China. So I don't think that this will shift because those countries are already fairly closely aligned.
And now that we are entering the 6th day, what are the implications of prolonged Israeli strikes on Iran's internal political stability, especially given economic pressure and airspace breaches?
Well, the wider implications of a longer war are just bad worldwide. For example, I can imagine that oil prices will be spiking all over the world, and this is going to affect us in the Philippines and probably people in India and in the United States and everywhere else. But your question, can you just repeat the last part of your question again?
Yes. So how will the strikes on Iran's internal political stability, especially given economic pressure and airspace breaches?
That's a very good question. And I really wish I knew the answer, but my view is that the Iranian regime, which has gone on since 1979, which has been cruel, inhumane, a consistent violator of human rights. I believe that the Iranian regime is as unpopular and hated right now as it ever has been. So in terms of whether this conflict goes on, which I hope it doesn't, I would see that this will tend to weaken the control of the totalitarian mullahs over the country. But it seems to me that this weakening will occur whether the war goes on or not.
And looking back at Middle East, how might Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE adjust their position as the US hardens its stance against Iran?
That's another good question. Thanks for that. My view is that given the animosity, the animus between Iran and the Gulf states, I would say that this will that although outwardly they're probably expressing anger and disapproval for their own domestic populations, I suspect that secretly they're quietly happy about Iran being subjected to this present conflict.
Thank you very much for joining us today. Now we move on to our next story.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky leaves the G7 summit in Canada without a joint statement of support from members or a meeting with US President Donald Trump, who departed early to address the Israel-Iran conflict. A Canadian official stated that the US blocked a strong G7 statement on the war in Ukraine, prompting Canada to drop plans for a unified declaration. The group instead issued a watered-down chair summary, which included support for President Trump's efforts on peace and a call for both Ukraine and Russia to observe an unconditional ceasefire. Despite the lack of a joint G7 stance, leaders apart from Trump expressed support for Ukraine. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer met President Zelensky at the summit. The two agreed to drive forward the next stage of military support and to convene the next coalition of the willing meeting in the coming weeks. Canada, which holds the G7 presidency this year, announced $2 billion Canadian in new military aid to Ukraine, along with fresh sanctions on Russia. Let's listen in to what Carney had to say about the Russia-Ukraine war.
With our international partners, we're launching a major new package of sanctions on individuals, on companies, on vessels, the Shadow Fleet, to exert maximum pressure on Russia. We're also sending over $2 billion in funding for drones, ammunition, armored vehicles. Ukrainians defend their territory, as well as a $2.3 billion loan to help rebuild the infrastructure in that country. And take a moment to reiterate our condolences given the barbarism witnessed overnight in Kyiv caused by Russia.
Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney also met Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi at the summit. The two agreed to appoint new high commissioners, signaling a thaw in diplomatic ties that had been strained since 2023. Take a listen into what Modi and Carney said separately about India-Canada ties.
विश्वास है कि प्रधानमंत्री जी के चुनाव के बाद मुझे पहली बार मिलने का मौका मिला है, तो इस चुनाव के भव्य विजय के लिए भी मैं उनको बधाई देता हूं और आने वाले कालखंड में उनके साथ भारत और कनाडा मिलकर के अनेक क्षेत्रों में प्रगति करेंगे. बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद.
We have had a discussion, the Prime Minister and I, about the importance of having the law enforcement to law enforcement dialogue, which is not just dialogue, cooperation directly. The importance of addressing transnational repression, as I noted, including when we met, and obviously there is a judicial process that's underway, and I need to be careful about further commentary.
Numerous bilaterals were also held on the sidelines of the G7 summit. Indian Prime Minister Modi also met South African President Cyril Ramaphosa and Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. He held talks with Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum on boosting cooperation in trade, pharmaceuticals, and science as well as technology. Meanwhile, President Trump held a phone call with Sheinbaum after cancelling their scheduled in-person meeting at the summit. And finally, French President Emmanuel Macron announced that France will host the next G7 summit in June 2026 at the Alpine spa town of Evian-les-Bains. Joining me on the telecast is my colleague Megha Sharma, Senior Executive Editor of NewsX World, reporting live from Banff, Alberta, Canada, with a complete lowdown on Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's final day at the G7 summit, including his key bilaterals, outreach sessions, and what's next on his diplomatic agenda.
The G7 Leaders Summit here at Kananaskis in Alberta, Canada has now gotten over, and with that, Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to Canada has also concluded. It has been a significant visit for the Prime Minister as he held a number of bilaterals, pool-asides, and also participated in the working session which was dedicated by the G7 host Mark Carney for the outreach nations including India, Ukraine, South Africa, Mexico, Brazil, who were all present to participate in the conversation that revolved around critical energy securities. Now, talking about the key bilaterals that were held by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, number one, of course, was the full focus on the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and Prime Minister Narendra Modi's bilateral. The key aspects of this meeting came to fore when both the leaders addressed the media, and Prime Minister Narendra Modi particularly spoke about how India and Canada ties go down in history, whether it is about the huge amounts of investments that Canadian companies have in India, or for that matter, the Indian diaspora and its investment in Canada in large numbers. Not just that, Prime Minister Narendra Modi spoke about how the last time that he visited in 2015, when Stephen Harper was the Prime Minister of Canada, and it is 10 years later that the Prime Minister has now visited and met Mark Carney on the Canadian soil. He expressed hope that with the leadership of the newly elected Prime Minister Mark Carney, whom he also congratulated for the victory in the elections, both the leaders, he hoped, would work together for the global good, for strengthening India and Canada relationship, as well as concretizing humanity and working for the greater good. In response, of course, the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney made similar references to how India and Canada can come together to work with resilience and cooperate on a number of issues, whether it is about creating supply chains for critical minerals, whether it is about utilizing natural resources for mutual good, or talking about fighting terrorism together, or talking about transnational crime and where two nations can collaborate, communicate, and cooperate in this area. Besides that, if I talk about the other pull-asides that the Prime Minister had, the first one was with the Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum. The second pull-aside was with the South Korean President Lee Jae-myung. Besides that, he also had a quick interaction with the South African President Cyril Ramaphosa. He also had a pull-aside with the French President Emmanuel Macron. And he also spoke during his meetings with all the leaders. He also had a pull aside with the Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. So this was in all a synopsis of how the G7 leader summit went for Prime Minister Narendra Modi. And of course, there was this grand welcome that Prime Minister Narendra Modi received at the hands of Prime Minister Mark Carney earlier in the day. He, of course, there was the photo session, the family photo of the G7 and outreach leaders, which included, of course, all the G7 leaders, barring President Donald Trump, who had to leave suddenly yesterday in wake of the Middle Eastern crisis that is worsening with time. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has now departed for Croatia. He will be there for a bilateral meet with the president of Croatia. He is going to be headed to Zagreb, the capital. It is going to be a little less than 24 hours visit that is being planned for the Prime Minister, and he will be arriving home in New Delhi on 19th. I'll keep a close track of all the developments that take place, and stay tuned on NewsX. I'm Megha Sharma with my camera person, Situ Madhavan.
After months of diplomatic chill, India and Canada seem to be moving towards a thaw, especially following Prime Minister Modi's meeting with his Canadian counterpart on the sidelines of the G7. Megha, after months of diplomatic friction, how significant was this meeting between Prime Minister Modi and his Canadian counterpart, Mark Carney?
It is a watershed moment in the India-Canada bilateral ties as Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his Canadian counterpart Mark Carney today held a bilateral where both the leaders decided to bring about a recalibration in the diplomatic, bilateral and trade and people-to-people relations of both the countries. The first step taken to that effect is the appointment of the new High Commissioners in Canada and in India respectively. Remember, it was a few months ago, because of the deterioration of the ties between India and Canada, which was under the leadership of Justin Trudeau, that the Canadian High Commissioner had been asked to leave the country. Something similar had happened in Ottawa, in Canada, where the Indian High Commissioner was asked to leave the country. Meanwhile, the two leaders also spoke about how there are going to be officials appointed to carry forward the stalled conversations, discussions and negotiations on the topic of trade, on the topic of culture, on the topic of education, supply chains that need to be built for critical minerals, that also is all going to focus on the stalled CEPA, which is the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement that India and Canada have been trying to sign for years together, but it has not fallen in place. So Prime Minister Narendra Modi, after having had that very important bilateral as well as other bilaterals that he had with the other heads of states that were present at the G7, which including the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, as well as the pull-asides that he had with the Mexican head of state, with the South Korean head of state. He also did a pull-aside meeting with the president of France, Emmanuel Macron. So all these meetings have borne result, and particularly the very idea, the very reason behind Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to Canada was to have that bilateral. It was on the minds of the two leaders that there needs to be something that needs to be done at the political level, at the head of the state level, to ensure that the debacles that both countries have faced in the last 1.5 years, because the relationship lowering to the lowest ebb, needs to be brought back to its normalcy, at least initiate the start of it. And Mark Carney, having been elected just a few months ago, has been the leader that has initiated that step with India. We'll continue to watch, keep a close eye on what happens in the future for India and Canada, with these two leaders deciding to put all the problems aside and turning a new leaf in the chapter that is going to be written in history.
Thank you, Megha Sharma, for joining us all the way from Canada. Well, that's all we have time for. We will continue to bring more news updates from around the world.